Hello and welcome to the 12 Great Men of Arda podcast. The last time I spoke of Elros Tar Minotaur and of the golden age of Numenor that he ushered forth for his people, all the way to the glorious reign of Tar Aldarion. Today I'll be taking you from the reign of Tar Ankalime to the end of the reign of Tar Palantir. The reign of Tar Aldarion brought with it a newfound interest in the seas, as well as in the continent of Middle-earth. Between this and increasing overpopulation in Numenor, it swiftly became apparent to the practical monarch that overseas colonies would soon prove necessary for his island nation. This, along with his concerns over the new shadow, that is to say, Sauron, caused him to press forward with increasing foreign exploits. The trouble for Numenor was that the rulers that followed immediately after Eldarion had none of his skill, his intelligence, or his energy. Preferring to frolic in the fields and distract themselves with petty politics and amusements, they left their colonial interests, allies, and even their boats to stagnate and rot, forgetting for the moment that they were an island nation and the most supreme naval force around. This was not the absolute rule, but generally, this was how things played out. The situation, such as it was a source of great concern for the High King of the Noldor Elves, Gilgallad, the first king since the first days of the Elves to reunite almost all of the disparate tribes under one banner. Gilgallad was the son of Orodreth himself, son of Finarfin. Like his father, he had a bold spirit, and like his grandfather, a wisdom that was never truly equaled even amongst the elves, so that it was he who first became aware of the shadow that loomed over the world. Unfortunately for all his brilliance, both in reuniting his people and ushering in a new golden age, after the cataclysmic events that ended the first age, Gilgallad could not quite convey to all his followers the same wisdom, notably to his cousin Celebrimbor, who was grandson of Feanor. Yes, that Feanor, the same who brought untold suffering, as the Greeks might have said, upon the elves with his passion. Celebrimbor, though, was not at all like his grandfather. Though he was unwise, he was of a trusting nature and always keen to prove his goodness and how unlike his father Curufin and grandfather he could be. Ashamed of his family heritage, he set about trying to prove himself the most devout supporter of the likes of Celeborn and Galadriel, themselves the chief vassals of Gilgallad. Dedicated to the most masterful lady of all the elves, Celebrimbor swiftly rose to a high position as not only a blacksmith, but also an administrator within the great city of Eregion. Trusted by Galadriel on account of how in love with her he was, doubtless something that must have caused irritation in the hot-tempered Celeborn, Celebrimbor also demonstrated himself Celeborn's superior. He it was who convinced a large segment of the dwarves to ally with Eregion, and even to settle there, and to add their own noteworthy skills at smithery to those of the Noldor. Now, if this sounds like a good time, that's because it was. And that's why it couldn't last forever. The chief blame for things going awry was Sauron. After the fall of Morgoth, he had been ordered to return to Valinor to stand trial for his countless crimes. He had refused out of fear and slipped away from Eonway, whereupon he went underground, biding his time until men and elves had forgotten him. This they did, and when the time was most ripe, he popped back up like a daisy under the guise of a messenger of the Valar. Known as Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, unsure of the man, Galadriel would not countenance his presence in her city. So there was only one thing to do. Celebrimbor was to chase Galadriel from Eregion. As to Celeborn, sources are split. Some of the tales claim he escaped with her, others that he was taken captive. It makes little difference, as Celeborn, on the whole, is inconsequential, beyond being there to knock up Galadriel with Celebrian. But we all know this to be the truth. Once in power, Celebrimbor learned the art of ringcraft from Sauron, and set about forging a bunch of rings with the guy, or rather, for the guy, given Sauron was too lazy to forge them all himself. I wonder what Mrs. Sauron thought of his not doing anything. Doubtless, she gave him the same earful that Wilma tended to give Fred Flintstone. Anyways, with Eregion secure, and in the hands of the still blinded by trust Celebrimbor, Anatar was to depart, as he had everything in place he needed to prepare Mordor. His plans, he believed, were about to finally come to fruition. It's not hard to see why. Numenor was sagging under unfit kings reluctant to do anything. Gilgallad ruled over a diminished people and weakened realm. Galadriel had been chased away. Celebrimbor had been tricked into becoming his man. Yep, it all looked like he had everyone where he wanted. Trouble for him was that he miscalculated. Celebrimbor was soon brought back to his senses, crafted 3 extra rings for the elves, and raced off to the lady who ruled his heart to earn her forgiveness, giving over to her and Círdan and Gilgallad his 3 rings as he did so. Encouraged to not return to Eregion, the noble son of Curufin would not listen to them on this matter. He promptly returned to prepare his beloved city and people for war. With the recognition by both his people and those he had usurped from the city that he was indeed Lord of Eregion, and with their admiration for his sense of loyalty. The grandson of Feanor had just redeemed the house. The trouble was that when Annatar shed his disguise and took up his true mantle once more as Sauron, and arrived with his 1 ring forged on his finger, he was to discover that the city would not open its gates to him. Enraged, Sauron was to break in, with there being terrible fighting in the streets. Celebrimbor himself made a fight of it, wouldn't confess the location of the remaining rings, and was slain. His corpse in vengeance for his defiance of Sauron was impaled on a spike and carried along as a hideous banner. Overall, I'd say Sauron was not overreacting, because don't we all do this ourselves when we get annoyed with someone? This was not simply the act of a barbarous Blackheart, but one of pure vengeance. As Sauron felt betrayed, as he had intended those rings for his own use, what Celebrimbor had done was theft in his eyes. No offense, but pretty Sauron, as his fans like to call him, really ought to have known better. After all, Celebrimbor had lied to Galadriel in the past over the matter of Annatar. Thus, as the Japanese proverb goes, it was inevitable that as a liar he should become a thief. Arriving shortly after Eregion was sacked, Elrond, the brother of Elros, the founder of Numenor, had by this time become Gilgallad's right-hand man, a brilliant leader and elf by any stretch of the imagination. Elrond had become invaluable to his cousin. In any event, he was swiftly outmaneuvered militarily by Sauron. It was thanks to the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, though, doing a brilliant sortie to repel Sauron that salvation came, and the survivors of Eregion and Elrond's forces fled north to found the great city of Imladris, or Rivendell. This accomplished, the heroic dwarves barricaded themselves in their mountain holdings because they were, smart. Sauron, though, would by 1699 of the Second Age cement his position throughout Eriador, and feeling confident, began to give way to brutal acts that were typical of him. Trouble was, he had run out of time. Numenor had by this time rallied and come under the brilliant leadership of a great military-minded king named Tar-Minastir. This king, whose name literally means the Vigilant, along with his naval admiral, Círdan, were to lead a brilliant campaign that swept away Sauron and put an end to his ambitions for Eriador. Driven from the Grey Havens by Círdan, Sauron was defeated at the Battle of Gwathlo, thus proving Numenorian military supremacy seemingly for the age. Battered and driven back, Sauron retreated to Mordor, his tail tucked firmly between his legs, and his ambitions for the moment shattered. All was roses and daisies, everything was to be hunky-dory forever and a day after this. Except not. Trouble was that Tar-Minastir would grow old, and his son Círdan came of age, and decided that he wanted the scepter. The circumstances in which he took the throne are murky. All that is clear was that some sort of coup took place, and Tar-Minastir was driven off the throne. 4 years later, he was likely killed by his ambitious son. Thus, blood had been shed between the royal family of Numenor. There could be no going back from this. Tar-Círdan was a curious sort of ruler. He did not engage in the sort of valorous military campaigns as his father had against Sauron, nor did he truly love the elves as his father had. Rather, he stepped up ship production, loved Numenor's armadas and army, and implemented reforms and expansions in favor of these very things. Afterwards, he took up Aldarion's mercantile colonies to a whole new level. What Círdan undertook was full-blown colonialism, as humanity was to bear witness to in the 19th century, or throughout parts of the pre-modern age at the hands of the Ottoman Empire. The trouble was that this was inflicted upon the very people that Numenor had in previous centuries sworn to protect. It is difficult to say what the elves felt at this, but likely they were horrified. None could have been more disgusted than Elrond. He had loved his brother, and here was the man's successors transforming into the very monsters that he had fought against in the War of Wrath. Tar-Kiryatan, for his part, arose in mysterious circumstances and was to fall away from the throne in even murkier ones. If the people of Middle-earth had hoped for a more compassionate, gentle-hearted ruler to succeed him, boy, were they in for a big surprise. Of one thing, all can be certain, there was nothing natural about the lengthened reign of Tar-Kiryatan. It had stretched seemingly forever amongst the men of Arda, so that it has to be mentioned that he did not fully die, but likely disappeared, having been, it is very probable, given one of the rings of power. His son Tar-Atanamir was to expand upon his father's operations, and the Empire of Numenor to such an extent that he was to become known as the Great. But this was almost certainly a self-appointed title. At the end of a long and admittedly successful, if bloody, career. If Kiryatan had complained at times about the ban of the Valar, the ban from traveling west to Aman, he had done so private. Atanamir, for his part, openly railed and complained against the Valar. Who were they to restrict him? Was it not he who was king of the greatest empire of mortals that Arda had ever seen? Was it not his line that had fought in the great wars of the First Age? And was he not kin to the Valar themselves through his ancestress Melian? These grievances in mind and heart, he was to speak rudely to the Valar's ambassadors, treating them as inferiors and demanding to know why he could not have the same gifts bestowed upon him as his ancestors Eorendil and Tuor, both of whom had been granted immortality and been made, for all intents and purposes, Maiar. To these complaints, the Valar responded reasonably that theirs was a fate apart, and that the Undying Lands did not by their very nature make people undying. Okay, so you can't trust the name, it's just an advertising gimmick, we might say today. Trouble was, Atanamir wasn't satisfied with these claims. Angered, he dismissed them. One thing was clear from this meeting. The kings of Numenor had grown arrogant beyond belief, had come to consider themselves the equals of Manwë, the king of the Valar. As for Tar-Atanamir, his own end was to be a slow one, slower than that of his predecessor. Unlike his predecessors, he did not surrender the scepter willingly. He lived and lived and lived until all had to have wondered if he was to live forever. I have no doubt the non-canonical sources that state Kiryatan was father to the Witch King, that these sources, i.e. the old RPG game, was on to something. Atanamir had to have been either a Nazgul or the Witch King. There's something rather unnatural about his reign. Doubtless he had recourse to unholy solutions and assistance to lengthen his life. Yet the end still came for him, as it must come for all men. But his wicked influence was to be felt all throughout the rest of the history of the island of Numenor, as Tar-Atanamir had set a terrible precedence by retaining the scepter for so long and refusing to abdicate when he could no longer discharge the many duties that came with being ruler of the greatest empire in all the world. It was his successor, though, Tar-Ankalman, who made rejecting the Valar and the Elves far more official policy, with the country and the court dividing itself during his rule between the Kingsmen faction that hated the ban and the faithful, or Elendil, who in turn still believed in friendship with the Elves and the Valar. Unfortunately, the latter had no sway, no influence, and were in the minority. It was some time later, after the reign of Atanamir's son, that a descendant of the king, Tarkalmakhil, a great conqueror in his youth, took up the throne with a duality of names, as Quendi was on the decline linguistically in Numenor. His alternate name is rather telling, Ar-Belzegar, so that he sounds rather like Beelzebub. It was Kalmakhil, though, who pushed Sauron once more from the shores of Middle-earth, as the Dark Lord had been pushing his claims outwards once more, in the hopes to reclaim some of the glory and power denied him in the old wars between him and the Elves. Kalmakhil, though, was too afraid of the Valar to cease using Quendi altogether, retaining two names. This went on in the monarchy until the reign of his grandson, whereupon Quendi was abandoned and even persecuted, thenceforth on principle. In regards to our tale, though, it was this grandson's own great-grandson, Ar-Gimmelzer, that began the process of truly removing all elvish influence from Numenor, outlawing at last the language in its entirety, claiming as he did so that the elves were the spies of the Valar, a foolish claim, but one that gained traction in paranoid, xenophobic Numenor, so that they took under his watchful eye a step closer towards the shadow. In turn, though, many of the Elendili fled to Gilgallad's court, in the hopes of settling upon Middle-earth, laying down in this way, though unknowingly, the foundations for the future kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor. As if to add insult to injury, or as though he were trying to simply prove what an SOB he can be, Gilmilzer ceased tending to the White Tree of Numenor out of simple spite against the Valar, as it was this tree that had been given to Elros by them at the founding of Numenor. Gimilzor's most noteworthy deed was not some piece of policy or diplomatic blunder, but rather his marriage to a great beauty who was like him descended from Tarkalmakhil. Yes, one of his cousins, the lady Inzelbeth. Inzelbeth, though, was a descendant from the house of Adunye through her mother, and as such she carried with her the dreams of the faithful and their love for the Valar and the Elves. This could only have made it a rather poisoned relationship, and a rather sad fate for the queen. It is very likely that this is part of the reason why she found happiness solely in her eldest son, whom she groomed to become a great monarch and raised with ideals of the Elendili. Her second son, though, was not to grow up a good man, as he was favored by his father and was named Gilgallad. Pay attention to him. He'll be kind of important later. The eldest son was given an appropriate Aduniac name, and when the time came that his father died, this heir issued his disgraceful name in favor of a regnal name in Quendi. The taking up of the name of Tar Palantir must have come as a great relief for the new king, who must have found hiding his beliefs stifling. Trouble was that while he reveled in openly caring for the White Tree, in visiting every year the Hollow of Eru upon Mount Meneltarma, the rest of Numenor was looking at him askance. Who was he to reverse hundreds of years of traditions? They asked themselves furiously. The king's men who had long enjoyed royal favor were chucked out, with the top jobs all given over to the faithful, and honor was given in every way to the Valar and the Elves. These groups, however, refused to heed his cries and pleas, ignoring his embassies and sending them home empty-handed, thus humiliating him. Tar Palantir could, regardless of his goodness, inspire naught but contempt amongst the Elves and Valar. And they weren't alone. Soon his own people were rather keen to see him overturned. Annoyed by his saintly nature and lack of despotic habits, the king's men turned now to his brother, who began to conspire to murder Tar Palantir. In turn, the king forgave his brother, though the continued conspiracies did wear upon him, so that Tar Palantir spent more and more time in the Tower of Tar Ministir in the west of Numenor, though he likely also did this out of desperation for the favor of the Valar. It is said that he often climbed the tower, looked west in the hopes of seeing Tol Eressëa, which was in turn clouded from his sight. Looks like the Valar do have a spiteful bone in their non-physical bodies. If this sounds at all unfair, it's because it kind of was. Sure, they could be mad at Numenor, but Tar Palantir was going above and beyond the call of duty to atone. But that aside, the Valar also knew that regardless how earnest he was, his people already hated them. While his brother was often away in the west, the wealthy Gilgallad was not idle. Despite his brother's desire to remain friendly with him, he encouraged rebellions and began to increasingly resist the orders of his brother. Fortunately for Numenor at the time, Gilgallad died. Though a remarkable captain, he died ignobly, if rather fittingly, of illness, only to be succeeded by his son Pharazôn. Pharazôn was to receive much favor from his uncle, who wished for peace, foolishly appointing Pharazôn to his father's command, and seeking to resolve the split in the royal house diplomatically. Pharazôn in turn sailed to Middle-earth, participated in a great many battles, and secretly began to form conspiracies. Yep, diplomacy was definitely the solution here, having by this time fathered a daughter and no other children, and increasingly ill as he grew old, so that he grew dependent upon the Elendili and his beloved daughter. It was at this time that he made his greatest and most tragic mistake. In his will, he nominated his daughter his heiress. The reason this was tragic was that Miriel was, according to the Silmarillion, someone who agreed with her father's morality and ideas regarding the Elendili and Numenor. For this reason, for her to be nominated as heiress could only end badly for her. Being a warrior society, it was kind of natural for Numenor to favor keeping its women folk at home to help run the economy in the house, while the men were off all but dying in Numenor's endless wars. And as a princess, Miriel would have been all the more sheltered, thus she could not have built a rapport with the heads of the military. In this way, her cousin had been blessed with an undeniable opportunity, as Pharazôn soon became a popular figure amongst the ranks of the nobility and military. On this point, she was similarly cursed to her father, who had never been much of a military man himself. Before the end claimed him, Tar Palantir was faced with one last rebellion, that of his beloved nephew Pharazôn. Having groomed Pharazôn to be the number 2 man in the Empire, it must have come as a shock, though it shouldn't have. It was thus with betrayal and his kingdom revolting against him that Tar Palantir breathed his last, dying a broken man who had been renounced by not only his people, but the very elves in Valar that he so loved. But this wasn't the end of the cycle of betrayals. No, that was to come just before the coronation of his beloved daughter Miriel. Bursting into the capital city, Pharazôn proclaimed himself with the support of his people and the army king of Númenor, and Miriel, his bride, so that he soon seized the palace, and therein the very halls her father had lorded over, he violated her. But as this is not a depressing enough picture, I'll leave you off with the very worst betrayal against Tar Palantir and Tar Miriel, that of the head of the Elendili faction, Amandil, Lord of Andúnie. Though he had been a favorite of Tar Palantir and had been given considerable wealth and favor, the moment the political and military winds had blown in the direction of Pharazôn, Amandil proved himself more loyal to Pharazôn, happily switching sides against Palantir and the Valar, and swearing his allegiance to Pharazôn. This in spite of the violation of holy Tar Palantir's true heir. Thus, in this way, Amandil had thrown his hat in with the Kingsmen, so that both faithful and Kingsmen turned upon, strangely, the faithful and the Valaran elves, and most of all, Tar Palantir, out of simple greed. Thus, the stage was set for the darkest hour in Númenor's terrible, dark history. And one thing must be made clear. Not one of the sinners who conspired against Tar Palantir would make it out of the tale with a happy ending. If you enjoyed this video and want to see a follow-up to this podcast, do smash that subscribe button as though you are Eru Ilúvatar visiting your holy wrath upon the fools who inhabit Númenor.